And joining us now live from Tel Aviv to discuss this further is international affairs expert Tom Gross. Mr. Gross, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello. Good morning.
Good morning. So, Tom, we are 12 days into the conflict. Ukraine President Zelensky is asking for a no-fly zone. So, will the West come to Ukraine's aid militarily?
Well, I think the West is willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, if I can put it that way, but it's not willing to lose lives itself. So NATO countries, they're arming the Ukrainians actually to the teeth. They've given the Ukrainians substantial amounts of sophisticated lethal weaponry. But in spite of this, the Ukrainians are outgunned by Russia, especially when it comes to the Air Force. But there won't be a no-fly zone because that would probably entail NATO directly fighting in the air against Russia. And after Afghanistan and Iraq, Western politicians don't want to lose a single soldier of their own. They don't think it will be popular domestically or look good on TV. And they certainly don't want to confront a nuclear-armed Russia. So I feel sorry for the Ukrainians in the sense that they've kind of been goaded into this war over years by NATO, suggesting that NATO is going to come to their defense. And this was the case with the Georgians before them. But in fact, I've never thought that Russia will be willing to accept a NATO warship base in the port of Odessa, which used to be Russian and is now Ukrainian. So they're supporting the Ukrainians in many ways, but they don't want to actually fight directly themselves. And I might add that it's a lesson that others have learned. For example, Israel, when push comes to shove, wants to look after itself. It didn't want to join NATO, and it realizes that when you're living with bigger enemy states, which would, in the case of Israel, now be Iran, Israel needs to prepare to defend itself in any way. And taking on a superpower militarily, as the Ukrainians have done, without preparing enough, but in other words, building up enough of a military, it's a foolish exercise in my view. It's not fair for the Ukrainians. It's just the way of the world. I mean, I would love, for example, Tibet to also be free and independent, but it can't happen as long as China doesn't want it to happen. So likewise for Ukraine, it's unfortunately living next door to a more powerful country that also has millions of ethnic Russians within Ukraine, as well as strategic interests.
Now, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what do you think is Putin's strategy at this point, and what is his state of mind? What does he hope to accomplish? He obviously is a complex person, but what do you think is his end game here right now?
Well, let me answer first of all about his state of mind before his strategy. I don't know what it is, obviously, but I'm pretty sure that contrary to some of the claims in the West, he's not gone mad. I mean, Western leaders have suggested, let me get this right, for example, former NATO Secretary General Anders Rasmussen said that Putin had gone crazy, and former American Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice said Putin's not wholly rational, he may be delusional. And in Britain, where I'm from, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson told the House of Commons that Putin was illogical and irrational, and the British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace said Putin had, and I quote, gone full tonto. Meanwhile, other Western analysts have suggested that Putin is suffering from brain fog associated with long COVID, even though there's no evidence at all that Putin's ever had COVID. So I don't know, but from judging Putin and also his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, they're ruthless and they're very shrewd strategists. I doubt that they've gone mad. They're playing a relatively weak hand on the global stage to project Russian power much further than it should be given in its economic and population size. So As far as his strategy, again, many people are suggesting that he's misjudged events and why hasn't Russia taken Kiev after 2 or 3 days. But again, I mean, it took the Germans months to take Paris after the outbreak of World War II. It took several weeks, I believe, for America to take Baghdad in the Iraq War. And I think the American-led troops numbered, I think it was 178,000. So a lot of troops. And if anything, Iraq was not as well armed as the Ukrainians are now. So I think it's too early to say. As far as what his endgame is, I don't believe Putin thinks that Russia can occupy Ukraine. It's a huge country of 44 million. I don't think Russia has the ability to occupy Ukraine, even if he wanted to. I think he's probably trying to grab the area at the south along the sea, Odessa, which I mentioned before, and so on, to weaken Ukraine. And I think it's maybe just wants to smash and punish Ukraine to make clear they're never going to allow Ukraine or other strategic countries allow them to be used as a Western forward base. It may be a horrible strategy and unfair, but I believe that's his strategy.
Now, do you think the West shares some of the blame in the situation that Ukraine now finds itself in?
Yes, I think the West does share some of the blame. I mean, again, one of the reasons I think a lot of Western politicians suggested that Putin all of a sudden went mad is because it lets them off doing a proper analysis of the context that led up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It means we can safely ignore everything that's been happening since the end of the Cold War, and particular in the last 15 years or so, as NATO has pushed for expansion right up to Russia's border in Ukraine and previously in Georgia. And in both cases, now in Ukraine and in 2008 in Georgia, Russia has reacted by invading those countries and seizing bits of territory. I mean, Russia still occupies North Ossetia and 1 or 2 other bits of Georgian territory. So I don't think, I think the West has misjudged the situation, and I might say it's really the British and Americans, because the French and Germans have cautioned provoking the Russians. And as Putin himself said in interviews in the couple of months leading up to the current invasion, he said America will not accept a Chinese or Russian naval base, troops in Mexico or Canada, making claims, Putin said, on California or Texas that used to be Mexican territory. America would not accept Mexico doing a military alliance with Russia or China, and he won't accept, or Russia won't accept, Ukraine becoming part of a Western military alliance, which is why he's insisting on Ukrainian neutrality. And the West is opposing that, but I'm not sure that the West is going to prevail in this case. In the end, they may have to leave Ukraine as a neutral state, as Putin is demanding.
Indeed. Now, talking about the economic side of things, do you think the increasing economic boycott of Russia may help turn the Russians against Putin? Can he be overthrown from within? But also, I mean, when we think about this, do you think that could be the case, or perhaps it may strengthen the resolve of Russians and perhaps make them a little more frustrated towards Western countries because of these harsh sanctions on the people of Russia?
Yes, well, I think you've pinpointed it exactly. I think there may be resentment against Putin, but there may be even more resentment against the West. Ordinary Russians are going to wake up now and they can't use Netflix, they can't use TikTok, they can't use their credit cards, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, PayPal. All of them have either stopped or downgraded relations in Russia. They also will probably think that some of the Western moves economically and culturally too are nuts. Like they banned Russian cats, pussycats, from taking place in international cat contests. They've also Even some Russian musicians who have denounced the war have still been refused to continue performing in the West. And then they're also banning things like Disney channels and so on, as well as Russian vodka, Russian art, Russian films and so on. So it's hard to say what an individual Russian might think, but I suspect for every Russian that is blaming Putin for the fact Russia's being thrown out of Eurovision and the Bolshoi ballet can't perform, they will blame the West. They will say, look, even if they don't agree with this war, in fact, the number of casualties thus far in the war are relatively low, in spite of what the West is, Western media are suggesting. In fact, let me get this right, United Nations, as of March 7th, the day before yesterday, from February 24th, in other words, the first 12 days of the war, the numbers of deaths were 406 killed, of which thankfully only 27 were children. Sorry, I should emphasize civilian deaths. So 406 people killed in almost 2 weeks and 801 injured, including 42 children. Those are the official United Nations statistics. They may be an underestimate, but in any case, this is very low compared to almost every other war in the world, and certainly compared to past wars, including wars which NATO were involved in, like Afghanistan and Libya, and even in Serbia. So they may say, why are you picking on us? We don't agree with the war, but this is not the worst war ever, and some of the casualties were indeed Russian civilians, ethnic Russians killed by Ukrainians. This is an incredible economic and cultural boycott of us as a result of what is, at least so far, a small war, and it may lead some in Russia to conclude, well, we are going to be more reckless now. We are going to aim more indiscriminately at civilians. If you're going to punish us for what's a relatively small number of deaths, we might as well not take care. We might as well kill a lot more. That is the danger. I should also add that, of course, Putin is in effect a dictator or an authoritarian leader, so it's not so easy for people just to overthrow him. Even if they're unhappy with the economic situation, it doesn't mean they can overthrow him. I would make an analogy with Iran. Iran has undergone many sanctions, economic sanctions, over the last years, and has had many popular protests in which the Iranian security forces shot dead many of their own citizens. But the regime in Iran is still in place. There's no sign that the Iranian regime is about to collapse, in spite of very strong economic sanctions, and in spite, the Iranian regime was willing to shoot dead protesters. So I don't think Putin will go easily. And as a final point I'd make is the West needs to be careful what we wish for, because even if Putin is pushed out of office and overthrown, and of course, I personally hope he is overthrown. He's a thug and does not belong in power. He belongs probably in prison. But even if he is overthrown, we don't know what kind of leader will emerge. It's not clear that it will be a liberal, democratic, pro-Western government that follows Putin. It could be a far worse, more ruthless, more oppressive government. I mean, in the past, Russia had much worse governments, of course, the most famous being Stalin. So we don't know that pushing Putin out will necessarily lead to a kind of government the West or the world will be more happy with.
Indeed. You raised some important points over there, because if Putin is to go, of course, when we look at the collapse of the Soviet Union, Putin was born from that, from the resentment of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So with Putin going, who knows how much of a worse leader we could see from that. And then the analogy you made, the comparison with Iran, of course, it's always the people who are going to be suffering by the actions of authoritarian leaders. So now I want to talk about Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. He was in Russia where he met Putin. So I'd like to know what you have to say about that. Of course, you're in Tel Aviv right now, so please do let us know. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so Israel is one of the only countries which still maintains relatively good relations with both the Russian and Ukrainian governments. Actually, Turkey being another one. This was built up under the previous Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. The reason that Israel built up good relations with Russia is because of Syria, because Russian troops and aircraft are right next door to Israel in Syria, and Israel feels that with Russia on the border, it needs good working relations with Russia, even though traditionally America is the closest ally of Israel. So last Saturday, Bennett, who's actually an Orthodox Jew, Prime Minister Bennett, made the unusual move of flying to Moscow for a 3-hour talk with President Putin. I say unusual because Orthodox Jews are not meant to travel on the Jewish Sabbath, which is on Saturday. So he broke the Jewish Sabbath, flew with his national security advisor and a couple of other senior aides to Moscow on a Mossad private Mossad plane. After spending 3 hours with Putin, he then flew directly to Berlin and met the German Chancellor in the evening before phoning 3 occasions to Ukrainian President Zelensky. So I think Israel might be in a position to try and negotiate, especially since Israel, of course, does have close relations with the White House and West European countries who do not want to go and visit Putin at the present time. So Israel may be in a position behind the scenes to try and broker some kind of peace deal between, or at least a ceasefire between the Russians and Ukrainians. Although I should say that the Israelis have kept quite quiet about exactly what was said at those meetings, and there are other people involved, including the Turks. President Macron of France also spent a long time on the phone yesterday or the day before yesterday with Putin. So there are various actors here trying to bring about a peaceful resolution of this conflict before it gets much, much worse, because I think, you know, as I said, the death toll is relatively low at this point. We're less than 2 weeks into the conflict, but if it's not resolved, it could turn into a much worse conflict that could drag on for years and have a death toll as high as the one in Yugoslavia 20 years ago, when at least 200,000 people were killed.
Indeed. Now, on another note, my last question to you, Tom. Finally, if you can please give us an overview of Israeli President Herzog's visit to Turkey. What's on the agenda, and how historic will this meeting be between Erdogan and Isaac Herzog?
Okay, well, as viewers probably remember, Turkey and Israel used to enjoy relatively good political and also defense relations in addition to economic relations. But about, I don't remember the exact date, I think it was 2010, 12 years ago, there was an incident with a flotilla bringing, it was led by a Turkish NGO, and it was bringing humanitarian supplies to Gaza. But Israel said, in fact, there weren't only humanitarian supplies on that boat, there were also arms for Hamas. Israeli Navy, I think, boarded that flotilla, and some people died, as I recall, including some of the Turkish NGO members. After that, the Turkish government very much distanced itself from Israel until recently. But in the last decade, what happened is that the Greeks and Cypriots, you know, who are traditional rivals of the Turks, have become much, they decided, they saw an opportunity, especially in defense terms, and they have moved much closer to Israel. Israel has also then made peace treaties with 4 additional Arab states, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. And I think that Turkey, the Turkish government, still led by President Erdogan, has reassessed the situation. There's also a new government in Israel now, the government of Netanyahu fell last year, and a new president, Herzog, who used to be the leader of the Israeli Labour Party. So they're not so hardline Israeli leaders. So I think that Turkey, the Turkish government, is also taking a different approach to Israel, and I think they want a reconciliation with Israel and a restoration of the previously relatively good relations that Israel and Turkey had prior to 2010.
Indeed, better relations between both means better prospects for the entire region. Tom Gross, thank you so much for taking out the time to speak to us. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I hope to have you again sometime again on this show.
Thank you. A pleasure. Have a good day.
You too.